If we can just give a cursory rise for our jurors who have entered the room, all rise. Okay. We are continuing now. Thank you very much. Well, not all, they were rising for the jurors. Okay. So, yes, all good. We're about to go officially into our count 3 part of the indictment on political prisoners and prisoners of war. If we can key up the Zoom for the examiner, which is Attorney Jaribu Hill, who will be directing the testimony of our brother Jalil Muntaqim. Let's just take a moment of silence while they're keying that up. And think about our brothers and our sisters who still languish behind bars. Our Sunyata Akoli and our Matulu Shakur and our Faranza Bowers and our Leonard Peltier and our Russell Maroon Schultz. Y'all help me out here. Let's call out some names of our folk who are in exile, Sister Asada Shakur and Brother Pete O'Neill. Let's hear those other names for our brothers and sisters behind bars. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. And now we're going to begin. We have Attorney Jaribu Hill, who's going to direct this testimony. Take it away, Sister Lawyer Warrior.
Thank you, brothers and sisters. We are back. So honored and excited to help to bring onto the screen the story and live for you. I'm so jealous. The story of our brother Jalil Abdul Muntaqim. I had an opportunity to trade a couple of emails with our brother Jalil, and I am so excited now to be able to open up this platform for this brother to tell his story. Brother Jalil, let me first congratulate you and the People's Movement on your stunning October 2020 release, averaging nearly 50 years behind bars. The fight to free you from the oppressor's cage in the wake of the current pandemic, better known as COVID-19, took center stage and shined a light on horrific human rights violations occurring in the system of mass incarceration for decades. Now, you are a freedom fighter, and you are what we called a political prisoner. My brother, would you please introduce yourself to these jurists, and of course, to those who may not know you in the audience, though I suspect there are not that many who don't know you, but can you just tell us a little bit about your background as a political prisoner and a revolutionary?
First of all, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most merciful. I'd like to first preface my remarks by giving some information about some other political prisoners. What I'm testifying to is not so much about myself, but by those who are still incarcerated. So if I may, I just want to bring some information out on a few. I cannot talk about all of them, but there are some that it needs to be referenced here. Particularly, and I'm going to be as concise as I possibly can. First, Mumia Abu Jamal. Many of you know who he is. He's been incarcerated over 40 years. He's 67 years old. Mid-April this year, Mumia went under heart surgery, which was successful. He was experiencing chest pains and was taken to a prison infirmary. He was discovered that several of his coronary arteries were blocked, which pushed for surgery. He has been previously diagnosed with congestive heart failure, diabetes, liver cirrhosis, and COVID-19. Mumia has suffered several harm because of medical, legal, and law enforcement and judicial professionals have not met the proper standards. He suffers from hypertension, as well as liver cirrhosis and diabetes, both induced by documented medical neglect. 2, Sunyata Okoli, incarcerated 48 years. 84 years old. He has served more than twice his original sentence. Sunyata has early stage dementia, and his health has deteriorated as a result of COVID-19. He has been denied parole 8 times, despite having 0 disciplinary actions in the last 27 years. Imam Jamil Alameen, incarcerated for 21 years, 78 years old. Imam Jamil is currently 78 years old, and is deteriorating health conditions. He has become legally blind and has suffered from cancer, dental problems, smoldering myeloma, and strokes. Number 4, Dr. Mutulu Shakur, incarcerated 35 years, 71 years old, had his 9th parole denial this last past January 2021. He has been diagnosed with life-threatening bone cancer, yet denied compassionate release. The situation is extremely urgent as his health is deteriorating rapidly. He is in constant pain from the bone marrow cancer with nothing offered to him but pain except for addictive oxycodone, which he refuses to take so he can stay as focused and as strong as possible under those circumstances. It is sad that the only pain medication being offered to him is a dangerous opioid, not dissimilar to the opioids developed in acupuncture protocols. He, as a detox, he used as a detox. He's one of the individuals who created the Black Acupuncture Detox Association. He's a pioneer in Black acupuncture. Russell Maroon Schultz, incarcerated for 49 years, 78 years old. Over the past few years, he has suffered first from prostate cancer and then from diagnosis in 2019 with colorectal cancer. He survived 12 rounds of chemotherapy before being approved for surgery to remove his primary cancer mass in fall of 2020. In 2020, he was diagnosed with COVID-19. After months of delay, he finally received his surgery, only to find that the cancer had metastasized. In the spring of 2021, it was confirmed that he has now terminal stage 4 colorectal cancer. In conversation since, Maroon has expressed that he is at peace with entering the transition of life to death and his desire to spend the final days surrounded by family and close friends. With this declaration, his legal team, the Abolitionist Law Center in Pennsylvania, filed a petition for medical transfer to a home hospice care in July. The grounds were that he had met all the necessary requirements, including being a model behavior, being unable to walk without the use of a wheelchair and other medical assistance devices, and that the prison environment cannot and will not support proper care for Maroon and his rapidly deteriorating health. Most recently, doctors have refused to give him some other medications he's supposed to have, some nutrients he's supposed to have. We are afraid that we will lose Maroon as another one of our comrades who are going to die in prison. Kamal Siddiqui is another brother who we are concerned about for his health situation. And the great warrior Leonard Peltier, who's also suffering from life-threatening illnesses while in prison. And there's many, many more. Now I'll talk about myself. I'm not very good at talking about myself. But nonetheless, I was arrested in August 28th, 1971. I was not released until October 2020. 49 years and a few months. I am the one who initiated the call for this hearings, for this tribunal. In 2018, I was held in solitary confinement. You heard Brother Salim talk about the conditions of solitary confinement. And I was sent to solitary confinement for teaching a class that was approved while I was in Attica Correctional Facility, teaching Black history. And I started from 1861 and led up to 1966. 1966 is the year of what? The birth of the Black Panther Party. I am a veteran of the Black Panther Party and a veteran of the Black Liberation Army, proudly. While in solitary confinement, I devised a proposal I send it to my comrade, Jihad Abdul Mumit, who is the chair of the Jericho Amnesty Movement, National Jericho Amnesty Movement, which I, myself, my co-founder, I'm the co-founder of the Jericho Movement while I was in prison, along with our deceased ancestor, Brother Baba Herman Ferguson, and also Sister Soffiyah Bukhari, Asa Bukhari. And so in the course of my initiated proposal, Brother Jihad Abdul Mubin and other comrades of Jericho and National, the Northeast Coalition for Political Prisoners and other organizations are gathered together to organize our campaign calling for the charge of genocide against the United States corporate government. I do not know what more I can talk about. I can probably go on and on and on about what I've accomplished while I was in prison, but I don't think that's necessary at this point in time.
Okay, well, wow, you've said so much already, my brother. Thank you for lifting up the names of all of our brothers who are in vulnerable situations because of the denial of basic human rights in terms of medical care and humane conditions inside. And we move that the documentation provided by Brother Muntaqim be added as part of the permanent record, the names of all those who are right now suffering from life-threatening medical illnesses and not being treated, being denied adequate treatment, being denied compassionate release, being denied the treatment that human beings deserve. And while we're on the subject of that type of denial, you mentioned COVID-19, and I know that your struggle to be released, led by yourself and thousands of others who signed petitions to get you released as a result of COVID-19.
Let me share. Let me share something about that. For the international jurors to understand some of the issues of denial of basic human rights.
Yes.
Prior to, well, let me put it this way. The institution was being infected by COVID-19, and my attorneys had the wherewithal to file a habeas corpus petition to have me released temporarily from prison so that I would not get COVID. And we were successful. We had a judge grant a habeas corpus for me to be released from prison temporarily until the docs, the Department of Correctional Services had a handle on these issues of issues of COVID-19. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yes, you are, but that's okay. It's a good slip. It's a good slip.
And while we were waiting for the decision to be approved, the Attorney General, Letitia James, appealed that decision for me to be granted.
Oh.
And in the interim, I caught COVID, caught it bad. I was in the hospital for 5 days on oxygen in the interim, waiting for that. And based upon that decision, based upon that appeal, the court said, well, now that he has it, the issues of him being released is now moot. And so I had to suffer in prison with COVID until I was able to be granted release about 8 months later. And so what we find is that the prison system, for the most part, even despite the fact that you may get a compassionate judge, a judge who has some understanding, they will continue to be less than fair, right, in regards to how they treat prisoners. They fear that if I was granted release, that it would set a precedent. So other people would come behind me and also ask for that kind of compassionate release. And as we find for our brothers and sisters who are now in prison, who are suffering life-threatening diseases, right? For instance, like Maroon, the state, right, is denying in compassionate release an opportunity for him to die in a hospice, right, outside of prison amongst friends and families. This is the kind of inhumane reality of the United States prison system and mass incarceration. Sister.
Thank you, brother. And here in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta, the home of Parchman, penitentiary, we know that there was an issue all across the South and many other places where the prisons were without any access to vaccines and testing regarding COVID, and the spread within the cages has reached an epidemic proportion. So we appreciate the background that you provided, and we also appreciate the struggle that you and others waged to shine a light on this particular atrocity and how the government plays its role. Now, you are a political prisoner. You are a released political prisoner. Can you share with us, and you went there and you stopped for a moment to continue this track, and now I want to push you back into it because I know that's where you gotta go. We gotta talk about COINTELPRO. We gotta talk about political prisoners and how they end up being caged because of their political beliefs. You are one of those brothers. Can you talk about that and the relationship between your being caged and the ongoing reality of COINTELPRO, which many people think is something of the past, when we know that COINTELPRO in all its forms still exists?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. There are two areas of concern for me in regards to what is COINTELPRO. And I think it's important for the jurors to understand COINTELPRO was an operation by the federal government, by the FBI, to destroy any progressive, revolutionary, or national or militant organization during the 50s and 60s and the 70s. For give some better understanding of COINTELPRO, I'm going to just read some of the primary objectives of COINTELPRO. This is the FBI. This is the United States government suppressing movements for liberation and independence. And we can talk about the international law that supports liberation of independence of oppressed people and oppressed nations. But at any rate, the February 28th, 1968, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, put out a memo, right, called LHM, Letterhead Memorandum. And in that memorandum, he said that, one, to prevent the coalition of Black militants, nationalist groups, through effective coalition of Black nationalist groups might be the first step towards a Mau Mau in America, beginning of a true Black revolution. Two, to prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been the Messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. Three, to prevent violence on the part of Black nationalist groups. Through counterintelligence, it should be possible to pinpoint potential troublemakers and not neutralize them before they exercise their potential for violence. Four, prevent militant Black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them in separate segments of the community. And five, a final goal should be to prevent the long-range growth of militant Black nationalist groups, especially the youth. There's another document of COINTELPRO, I think it was March of 1968, whereby J. Edgar Hoover stated specifically that if young Black activists decide to become revolutionaries, they would be dead revolutionaries, right? He said they would be dead revolutionaries. He didn't say they would be captured and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. He said they would be neutralized, right? Part of the idea of COINTELPRO was to neutralize a movement and to neutralize people. And this is the reason why we had the death of Fred Hampton. This is the reason why we had the death of Mark Clark. This is where you had the death of Bunchy Carter and John Higgins and many others, by the virtue of the means by which COINTELPRO operated to create dissension, to infiltrate, and to destroy a movement. COINTELPRO operated as what the government would do to destabilize a country, use every resources available to them to destroy the Black Panther Party. And by virtue of that, we fought back.
Thank you so much for that. And I move that we put all of what you've just said regarding COINTELPRO, its history, and the damaging effects it has had on the Black liberation movement and all oppressed people's movements, those documents be made part of the appendices to the outcome of these tribunal proceedings. I want to ask you about the conditions of confinement that political prisoners suffer under, and how is that different from the general population?
Thank you for that question. It is very important to understand that our relationship to the state is one is political, right, are engaging to be incarcerated in the first place, to be in prison in the first place is based upon our politics. And therefore, our relationship to the state is that of politics. Although they criminalize our politics. They criminalize their means for which they convict us in the court of the criminal courts of law. And therefore, they try to deny the existence of political prisoners. I just wanted to make this point clear. Back in 1977, I initiated the first petition to the United Nations by prisoners for the existence of political prisoners, and in the course of that, the conditions of prisons itself. And as part of the process, at one time, then UN Ambassador to the United Nations, Andrew Young, was asked, this is in 1978, was asked a question that I posed to him by VA journalist: does political prisons exist in the United States? And he said, perhaps thousands. That was his answer, right? And you can find it in the New York Times. You can Google Andrew Young, who was the UN ambassador at the time of the United States, and he was vilified by the press and vilified by Jimmy Carter, who was the president of the United States at that time. Thousands of political prisoners, as he said, right? However, because they criminalized us and put us in prison, right, they denied the existence of political prisoners in the United States. The only industrial nation in the world that I'm aware of who denies the existence of political prisoners. All right. Our condition of political prisoners, because we are political, the state, for the most part, tried to suppress our capacity to teach, right, in prison. Right. Again, when I mention the fact that I was sent to a solitary confinement for 4 months for teaching a class. Well, not so much of my teaching the class, it was what I was teaching. I was teaching the history of resistance. And we find that in the course of being in prison, one of the things that they do not want us to do is teach prisoners, to raise their consciousness, to remove their relationship of a criminal mentality to move one towards a revolutionary mentality. And by virtue of that alone, we, political prisoners, are targeted inside prisons. We are targeted for segregation. We're targeted to be removed from the populations. We're targeted in every kind of way that we try to evolve ourselves inside prisons. They try to suppress it, right? Try to make it a non-entity while in prison. And this is the reason why, for the most part, most, not many, most, but not all political prisoners are held in special times of confinement, right? Segregated of one form or another, or refuse release from prison. For instance, an example is Veronza Barrows. Veronza Barrows was granted parole 10 years ago. Was on his way out the door, with the superintendent escorted him. Superintendent got a phone call from Anthony Gonzalez, who was the Attorney General of the United States, and reversed his parole. He's still in prison for no other reason, because he's political, because he's a political prisoner. And they deny his release. Very similarly, Sunyata, like I said, been to parole board 8 times. Me, I went to parole board 14 times. Wow. I was eligible for parole in 2002. I was not released until 2020, right? Fighting these people to be released from prison. I got lucky, right? And so we have many of our comrades still in prison that we're fighting for release. That's the reason why there's a human rights crisis here in the United States. And human rights crisis based upon the United States is subject to the idea of white supremacy. This is a white supremacist nation. It's a white supremacist country. If anyone have any doubt about that, then you just go back and look at what happened on January 6th. Right, yes. When the white supremacists stormed Congress. If there was black, brown, or indigenous people doing that, they've been mowed down in the streets. No ifs, deaths, or buts about that. They're mowed down in the streets and been dead. Bodies everywhere. But not the white people. Why? Why didn't they mow them down? All right, because ideologically, they're on the same page, the page of white supremacy. All right, and this is what we are fighting against. This is why we bring the issues of human rights to the international community, right? And I'd like to make this point also clear in regards to our political prisoners, right? That we need to have support from the international community. Our comrade Mumia Abdul Jamal has an international support base, where we need to extend that to all of our comrades. The Jericho Amnesty Movement that I co-founded back in 1998 has the longest existing political prisoner support group in the United States. We've been in existence for 21 years, right? And we're bringing this issue back into the international community.
Thank you so much. And we move, of course, the record of the history of Jericho and of the Jericho movement, and also the names of all those political prisoners, as we said before, who are in dire need of our international support against these human rights abuses. I want to just talk about a victory that you had, and I know all of this spells out the hypocrisy of this empire, all of it, everything that you have described, because there is a US Constitution and supposedly there are amendments, including the 8th Amendment, and of course the 15th Amendment affords us supposedly the right to vote. But you ran up against that in Texas, where you attempted to register to vote, and you were prosecuted for doing so. Can you tell us what happened when the local Republican Party made it its business to vilify you for trying to exercise your human right to vote?
Yes, I was released on October 6th, 2020. 2 weeks later, well, let me put it this way. As soon as I was released from prison, they escorted me to see my parole officer. When I got to see the parole officer put a ankle bracelet on my ankle, monitoring me for 6 months with an ankle bracelet. However, the parole officer told me to go to the Department of Social Services and see what benefits may be available to me, since I had been recently released from prison after 50 years. When I went there, I filed some documents. And one of the documents was to register to vote. All right. And by filing to register to vote, a pundit who did not, a right-wing pundit up in Rochester, where I now reside, the city of Frederick Douglass, the city of the greatest abolitionists that we've known in the history of Black America. In that city, they decided that they wanted to prosecute me for registering to vote, and they arrested me. 2 weeks after I was released, they arrested me in front of my mom's.
And what happened after that?
We developed a campaign to fight back. And it took me about 4 or 5 months for have those charges, actually about 6 months to have those charges dismissed. They knew they was wrong in the first place. This is the right-wing Republican Party who made an effort to have me sent back to prison because they didn't want me out in the first place. All right, and so we fought back and was able to survive that attempt to have me reincarcerated.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's important for our jurists to understand that even once you are released, even once you have supposedly paid your debt to society, if you owed a debt in the first place, you are vilified and criminalized and prosecuted all over again and convicted all over again once you are released. The difference this time with you, Brother Jalil, is that you launched a movement even after you were released, and you could have been sent back for a long sentence, but you sacrificed that possibility, and you made it possible for others' voices to be lifted up around this question of not ever being allowed to participate in civil society, which is a human right. We appreciate your efforts, we honor you, and we celebrate your courage. And we do hear you loud and clear when you say it's not about you, it's about all of the political prisoners. Set the captives free. That's what we want. We want the cages to fly open, the doors to fly open, and we want the captives set free. And with that, I'm going to give you an opportunity, not that I can give you permission, I'm going to offer you the opportunity to close us out with final words, and then we turn the mic back over to the tribunal officials.
Thank you, thank you. Final words. There's several things that I want to say in terms of final words. One is this: the United States prison system is a slaveocracy. Right? It's very important to understand it, for the international jurists to understand that. We talked about the spirit of Mandela. We have what's called the Mandela rule, right? What is the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners under the United Nations. And the United States is in violation of every one of those standards, primarily every one of those standards. Why? Because slavery in the United States has never been abolished. Understand what I'm saying? Slavery in America has never been abolished. It's been penalized. It's been put in the prison system. The 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution has an exception clause. The exception clause states that prison and voluntary servitude should not exist in the United States except for those who have been duly convicted of a crime. The exception clause. Understand that. Now, the United States prison system is a slaveocracy, right? It's in the law, it's in the Constitution, right? And the only issue that we have to deal with that is one of the questions that we have to deal with that was what we mean by duly. What does duly really mean? And if we understand white supremacy and the institutional white supremacy, right? Institutional racism, right? That most Black, brown, and indigenous people have to confront in the criminal justice system, then we have to question the idea of the ideal of what is duly, right? It's stacked against us from the day we walk into the system. It's stacked against us from the time they put the handcuffs on any Black, brown, or indigenous people, right? There's no such thing as duly, right? It's not duly, right? It's racist. It's supreme white supremacy, right? Across the board.
Thank you, brothers. Thank you so much, Brother Jalil. All power to the people. Set the captives free. Free all political prisoners. Genocide International Tribunal 2021. We salute everyone who's in the audience. We thank our jurists for your attention to these urgent matters. I turn it back now to Sister Nkechi.
All power to the people. Black power to Black people. Free the land. By any means necessary. Freedom fighter. Free them all. What's the call? What's the call? All right. Okay. So we're going to now turn to the testimony of People's Lawyer, Soffiyah Elijah. We're going to key that up, and she's going to be, her testimony will be directed by Cynthia Roseberry, who actually was the attorney during the Obama administration for the Clemency Project 2014. So we're going to see this testimony right now.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Roseberry. I'll be an examiner today. I'm a criminal defense lawyer and justice lawyer for over 2 decades now. Today, we're talking with an expert, Soffiyah Elijah. Welcome, Soffiyah.
Thank you. It's good to be participating.
Thank you. So just for the record, would you say your name and tell us about your credentials?
Certainly. So I'm Soffiyah Elijah. I currently serve as the executive director of the Alliance of Families for Justice, which is a nonprofit organization based in Harlem. It's a statewide organization that provides support, empowerment, and mobilization for families who have incarcerated loved ones and people who are justice involved. I'm a criminal defense lawyer by training and a former law professor. And for over 40 years, I've been a criminal defense attorney. And for about the past 30 plus years, I have focused a good deal of my pro bono hours on representing, defending, and advising people who are political prisoners and prisoners of war here in the United States.
Thank you very much. So as a lawyer who's represented and advised numerous political prisoners, have you noted any similarities in their situations? And if so, can you explain that to us?
Yes, I've noticed a number of similarities with respect to the conditions in which people who are political prisoners are held in this country, and in the way that the parole boards have continued to deny them release when they're eligible for release on parole, and also the continued ignoring and neglect of their medical needs. So I can elaborate a bit if you want.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I guess I'll start with parole boards. Routinely, people who are political prisoners are denied release on parole, despite the fact that they have exemplary disciplinary records during their incarceration. And routinely, parole boards ignore their accomplishments while they're inside. They ignore their educational accomplishments, the fact that younger incarcerated people tend to look up to them for guidance and comporting themselves in line with the rules of the institution. That seems to matter not. The only thing that seems to matter is that they are not renouncing their political views and beliefs. And this is shown up many, many times with numerous political prisoners across the United States, whether they're held in state facilities or federal facilities. Medical neglect is common, and I'm sad to say, actually, it's not only common for political prisoners, but generally for people who are incarcerated in state and federal facilities across the country. What is true with respect to political prisoners is their needs are even more neglected and, I would say, intentionally ignored routinely. And this goes from small medical needs to major ones. And a number of political prisoners have died inside. I guess the last, but certainly not the least, has been how they're confined. Almost all of them has spent a considerable amount of time in solitary confinement. Right after 9/11, a number of them were immediately held incommunicado. They couldn't receive visits, letters, or phone calls with their lawyers or their families. And this went on for some of them for months. And that directive came directly from Washington, D.C., from the Attorney General.
So you've mentioned their conditions. Are these among the most egregious conditions of confinement faced by political prisoners, or what are the most egregious ones?
I think solitary confinement is one of the worst. Several of them have been subjected to physical abuse and beatings, including Herman Bell, Sundiata Acoli, and numerous others. Also being confined in far off places, very difficult for their families to be able to visit and stay in contact with them. Legal mail and social mail is routinely tampered with. Phone calls frequently are difficult to get or interrupted. Those kinds of things are pretty routine, particularly for political prisoners.
Thank you for that. And are there any difference or distinctions that can be explained by the fact that some may be in serving federal sentences and others may be serving state sentences?
You know, that's a good question, but I think it's fair to say that the answer is no. That whether they are under the jurisdiction or state facility or federal facility, the way that the parole boards are responding to them is the same. Their confinement is the same. I will say, the federal facilities that hold people in what they call supermaxes, there's fewer of them. But then when you look at all 50 states, almost every single state has a number of supermax or high security solitary confinement settings. And virtually all political prisoners have found themselves in those at one time or another. And if you look at, for instance, the Angola 3, all of them spent many decades in solitary confinement.
So I'm going to turn in a minute to, some of the things that have been done to address, but I want to ask, have family members of political prisoners been treated in a way that you would describe as egregious?
I would definitely say that they have been treated in a way that's egregious. Family members, it's already difficult for family members who have incarcerated loved ones to stay in touch, to visit. When you think about the point that I was making earlier, that many of them have been shipped off to far off places, particularly within the federal system here in the United States. If you're in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons, you can be held in any Bureau of Prisons facility, any place in the country. So your home may be Florida, but you may be incarcerated in the northwest part of the country, et cetera. So that already is difficult. If I turn just for a moment to Assata Shakur, who unfortunately is no longer in custody, but her daughter and her son-in-law have literally been abducted off the street and held for questioning by the local and I believe also federal law enforcement authorities. And this has happened on more than one occasion. Family members frequently are concerned about whether or not their mail is tampered with, whether their phones are tapped. So it's very, very difficult for family members. And then there's just the stress and the anxiety about the safety of their incarcerated loved ones. One thing I didn't say, but I'll just say it really quickly because I'm mindful of time, is that the nature of the prosecutions against political prisoners is also very different from people who are charged socially. So the charges are shaped in an effort to make sure that they're literally buried inside prisons and that they never get out.
So political prisoners in the U.S. have languished in prison for decades. And, why is this? What are the strategies that have been employed to address this problem?
Well, the why is pretty simple, and I think it's that the US government is intolerant of any right to resistance or dissent and has no appreciation or understanding of the right of people who are oppressed to fight their oppression, particularly if those people are Black and brown. Okay, now I'll move to the strategies. So over the course of several decades, various defense committees have arisen and support committees that are focused specifically on elevating the circumstances that various political prisoners are held under and also advocating for their release on parole, raising money for their legal defense, raising money for commissary, raising money so their family members can go visit them, stay in contact with them. I think those strategies have been helpful, hiring lawyers who have good politics to represent them before the parole board, prepare them to go before the parole board, and to appeal denials of their applications for release on parole. So those are some of the strategies, and there's certainly some joint strategies, tribunals, such as the one that we're having now. And we had one back in 1990, and building connections to other social justice struggles, expanding the base of support. All of those are parts of the strategies that have been pursued.
Thank you. And I just want to ask if you have any exhibits or documentation that you'd like to submit for the tribunal. We will include those if you'd like to enumerate them now, or if you'd like to enumerate them later, we will definitely include those in the tribunal.
I submitted a couple of pieces. One that talked about the conditions of confinement that are faced in specific by Black and New African political prisoners. It's a document that I wrote for the tribunal that I referenced that happened in 1990. My memory might be a little fuzzy. It was either 90 or 92. It was, let's say, back in the day. And then there's another piece that I wrote not long after the September 11th situation that I referenced, where a number of political prisoners were held incommunicado. So I wrote that, I guess you would say, within the past 20 years. So I submitted those two things. I've written a number of other things, but I didn't submit them. If I can put my hands on them relatively quickly, I'll happily submit them as well.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for your decades-long work for the liberation of political prisoners.
Thank you. It's an honor to do this work.
So, this the International Tribunal has really been blessed to have the support of Howard University, Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, as well as the Howard University School of Law Movement Lawyering Clinic. And we've been, we're talking about the next generation, because who's going to carry on this work? Okay, so the next testimony will be directed by David Carter from Howard University. Come on, up here, yes. And your witness will be none other than Sister Johanna Fernandez.
Thank you. May it please the court. My name is David Carter. I'm a law student at Howard University School of Law, a part of the Movement Lawyering Law Clinic. Now, ma'am, if you could please state your name for the record.
Yes, my name is Johanna Fernandez.
Thank you so much. And can you please state your occupation and your current academic and educational credentials?
Yes, I'm an associate professor of history at Baruch College of the City University of New York. I teach 20th century US history and the history of the civil rights and Black Power movements. I also sued the NYPD for the surveillance records of the Young Lords, and what emerged after a 2-year suit of the NYPD was the lost handshoe files, the largest repository of police surveillance records in the United States, namely those of police surveillance of New Yorkers over 1 million surveillance records of activists, including those of Malcolm X.
Thank you for that. And can you offer some historical perspective for understanding the problem of Black, Brown, and Indigenous political prisoners as a dimension of the problem of hyper-incarceration in the United States?
So yes, thank you for that question. This is an important question that has been eluded by conversations on hyper-incarceration and mass incarceration. It begins the conversation in public discourse with the 1980s and 90s. But in fact, the origins of hyper-incarceration today can be found in the 1960s with political imprisonment. And to understand the level of repression unleashed against civil rights and Black Power movement organizers, we have to understand what the state would be leaving on the table if Black people prevailed in America in the 1960s. First of all, the post-World War II period was an era of wars and revolutions against European colonial rule. And Black radicals were making common cause with those colonized countries. And so for the United States, the repression of an organization like the Black Panthers was about winning the Cold War. But then we have to take a step back and think about what else was at stake for the United States. Why did the United States go after civil rights and Black Power movement people that we celebrate today in many cases? I think it's important to just say that the Civil War, we start with the Civil War, which is known as the Second American Revolution. And the Civil Rights Movement is known as the Second Reconstruction after the First Reconstruction, after the Civil War. The problem with the Second American Revolution, the Civil War, was that it was a conservative revolution. That's because it ended the formal system of slavery, but the former slaveholders were ironically invited back to remake society anew. And I would ask, if we had time, what usually happens to the losing side in a revolution? It gets decapitated, but in the United States, the losing side was invited back to remake society. And that had massive consequences for how Black Americans live today. That class, the old slavocracy, launched a counter-revolution to regain their wealth and power. And what was at stake? The labor of 4 million enslaved Africans, which essentially had produced in the South the second wealthiest society humanity had seen, second only to the wealth of the British Empire. So the bloodthirsty counter-revolution sought to control Black labor and return the Southern economy to as close a replica as possible to slavery. So the slavocracy essentially launched a multi-pronged campaign that included the birth of the Ku Klux Klan, which is a terrorist organization which recruited white people of all classes as its foot soldiers. The old slavocracy also joined the both political parties, the Democratic and Republican parties in the South, disenfranchised Black people, poor white people too, and established Jim Crow. And for the next century, white Southerners carried out pogroms against Black people as a matter of communal ritual. I'm saying all of this because that's essentially the system that was going to be held up, that was held up for 100 years. The important thing about this is that unlike authoritarian rule or dictatorship, fascism depends on a large swath of the population to carry out the interests of the state. And what we have in the South is a fascist rule for over 100 years. So the people who challenged Jim Crow Robert Williams, the progenitor of Black Power, what he was up against was a challenge to fascist rule, and therefore the Black Panther Party, who grew up in the North. So fascist society deployed terror against people, against citizens, and that's what we have, what we see happening in the South and in the North. And I'm going to end in a minute. When the civil rights movement emerges in the South, Southern politicians have to somehow save their fascist system. So they launch a campaign of law and order to criminalize the likes of Martin Luther King, whom we celebrate today, SNCC workers, Fannie Lou Hamer, and others. In the aftermath of World War II, a war allegedly fought against Nazi Germany, the slavocracy essentially had to restrain its language. So it had to use law and order as the code word for exterminating the brutes in America, the Black Americans. But that was the language that essentially sicked the police, the carceral state, against those who were resisting authority. Law and order became the language to bring Black people resisting racial apartheid to heel. Politicians concocted at the same time a moral panic around crime that linked Black resistance to crime. And Brother Muntaqim mentioned this. In the North, the Democratic Party, supposedly the friend of Black people, embraced the same language of the criminalization of Black protests after the rebellions of 1964, 1965, and especially 1967. In the North, the Black Panther Party argued that the real problem in American society was racial apartheid undergirded by an economic system. And therefore, there were going to have to be deeper economic and political changes if Black people and other people in this country were going to see freedom. They pointed out that deindustrialization was tearing apart Black America, that Black people had been excluded from the unions and its well-paid jobs, that Black people of all classes had been trapped in the Black ghetto as a result of de facto racial segregation that kept them out of decent housing now, and that they were being displaced now by urban renewal, which was that era's gentrification project. And they argued that Black people were subjected to the savage inequalities of neighborhood schools and hospitals and summarily lynched in the streets by the police. They were saying all of this and saying that there was going to have to be a restructuring of America if Black freedom was to be achieved. And they were saying this at the time of the Vietnam War, when the Vietnamese people were defeating US empire in Vietnam. This challenge to the United States was too deep for the US to withstand. And so the United States in the 1960s cranked up its apparatus of repression, killed dozens of Black Panthers extrajudicially, including Fred Hampton and Bob Clark, through the counterintelligence program of the FBI. Its politicians passed a series of carceral laws, including the Crime Bill of 1968, which made it possible to wiretap without a court order, legalized stop and frisk for the first time in American history, and expanded the power of the police to keep Black people in their place and to bring rebellious Black people to heel. They passed the H. Rap Brown Law in 1968, which made it illegal to cross state lines to give a speech. If you look closely, the decade of the 1960s ended with the arrest and criminalization of Black radicals. The movement turned from a movement for jobs, against discrimination and police violence, toward a movement to free our activists, our leaders, people who were fighting to defend themselves against the homicidal campaign that the state launched against them and their people were essentially imprisoned. Contrast this to the white supremacists who took over Congress on January 6th, who have mostly gotten fines. So after the state unleashed a campaign of repression against Black radicals in the 1960s, after they convinced Americans that this was good law and good policy, in the 1980s and 90s, they generalized these policies against the majority of Black and Latino people who were now extra bodies in the context of deindustrialization. These people now needed to be warehoused. The objective of my remarks has been to illustrate the ways in which what we know today as the largest carceral nation in the world emerges not randomly in the 1980s and 90s. It emerges out of a campaign unleashed against the freedom fighters of this country who civilized American society in that period, Black radicals.
Thank you for that. Now, I know that you've done some research and work on specifically the Young Lords and some of their tenets that they called for. They called for releasing of political prisoners under the basis that many of their Puerto Rican brothers and sisters were persecuted by colonial courts and not by a jury of their own peers. Do you see that there's a correlation between their struggle for understanding that these courts are not in any way, shape, or form giving fair due process, fair treatment of these individuals who are speaking out on the injustices of the country brought on Black and brown and indigenous people, and the treatment of Black political prisoners as well?
So the Young Lords are the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. They were hugely influenced politically by the Black Panthers, and they succeeded as much as they did because they didn't have to remake an organizational or political model. They took the model established by the Black Panthers and ran with it in the barrios of New York and Chicago. The Young Lords are important, however, because they're the only group in the United States that emerges during this period that can actually identify an island outside of the US mainland that's actively colonized by the United States. Both the Black Panthers and the Young Lords thought of themselves and their people as colonized people. They literally called Harlem and East Harlem and Puerto Rico the colony. And part of what they argued was that the colonized can never find justice in the courts of the colonizer. The least of the problems is that we do not have juries of our peers. What they argued was that it is incumbent on the colonizer to strip the colonized of their culture, their history, their humanity, and to criminalize and dehumanize them in order to justify their super exploitation. I'll say this before I let you ask the next question. Black Americans, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, and Mexicans in the 60s argued that racially oppressed people in the United States are a different people, a different country, a nation within a nation. And on that basis, I would request that this body of judges consider that under UN Resolution 242, colonized people, oppressed people, people who've experienced genocide as a result of occupation have the right to defend themselves against colonial rule by any means necessary.
And finally, would you characterize from your statements that this is an intentional or willing systematic deprivation of the right to self-determination on the part of Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples, and thus a deliberate infliction on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part by the United States?
Absolutely. The history of the United States shows that it has systematically attempted to eviscerate, destroy, exploit the lives of racially oppressed people, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, Black Americans, Mexicans, also colonized people. And on that basis, they've imprisoned those who've been at the forefront of amplifying the struggles for liberation and the highest aspirations of colonized people in this land.
I thank you so much for your testimony, and I would like to submit to the jury to put into the record Professor Fernandez's book, Young Lords, A Radical History, for the record. Thank you so much. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you so very much for these very critical testimonies as part of this international tribunal. And, you know, it's just so heartwarming when we see our freedom fighters coming home. The next testimony you're going to hear is someone also who recently came home, like Jalil came home, like Jaruba came home, Geronimo, Laura, Linda, Susan, you know, the list goes on and on, Herman, and the like. So we would like to have Sekou Odinga come on and take the stand, and he is going to be examined by attorney from the West Coast. We're going to put him on the screen, Attorney Ade Jackson. And welcome home. You've been home for a while, but, you know, I got to just say, you know, it's just heartwarming that you're no longer behind bars, and hopefully many more will follow suit. Attorney Ade, I'm going to turn it over to you, my brother.
All right. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ade Jackson. I'm an attorney here in Los Angeles. I'm here, you know, as the examiner for the witness. And can you state your name for the record, please?
Sekou Odinga.
Thank you. And, you know, I'm going to get straight to it. Do you consider yourself a political prisoner?
I did consider myself a political prisoner when I was in prison, yes.
And how did you become a political prisoner?
I become a political prisoner through my political activities and being captured by the oppressor state. I was a combatant in the Black Liberation Army and was captured in 1981 while trying to help transport another combatant, another soldier of the Black Liberation Army. And he was captured also, but murdered in the street while he lay there in submission, trying to give up. They walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. So, but because of our political activities against the state, I consider myself a political prisoner. And I would say that based on how we were treated, how I was treated, the state considered me a political prisoner also.
And can you explain why you think the state even considered you a political prisoner?
Well, first of all, after my capture, I was beaten and tortured for the next 6 to 7 hours. They usually police in the States, they capture somebody or arrest someone. They don't torture them for no 6 or 7 hours. They might smack them upside the head or beat them up a little bit for a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes. That's par for the course, you know. But political prisoners, they usually save a particular brutal torture for them if they decide to torture them. And they decided to torture me. So on my way from the streets to the precinct, I was, my head was split open with a handheld walkie-talkie that one of the cops, after he cuffed me in the back with my hands in my back, decided to hit me in the head and knock me down, almost knocked me out. And that's how it started. But from there into the precinct, they kept me cuffed with my hands behind my back. Stood two police on each side of me and started interrogating me. And every time I would answer a question that they would ask me that they didn't like the answer, they would beat me or burn me with a cigar. Or at one point they decided to take my shoes off, and one of them had these big engineer boots. He just took and grind my toe until the toenail came off the toe. It was, and this went on for about, like I said, 6 to 7 hours. They took me into the bathroom, stuck my head in the toilet and flushed the toilet. I guess that was their idea of a waterboard or whatever, but all the time asking me questions about other comrades that they were looking for, Asada Shakur being one of them, Abdullah Majid being another one, but a number of people they were looking for, and they thought I might know who they were, and they continued to brutalize me.
And were there other times that you were tortured by federal or state authorities?
No, that was the main time. You know, I was never. After that, I got into confrontations with prison guards, but never tortured, never no systematic beatings and torture like that. From that initial torture, I wound up in the hospital for 3 months. You know, they basically destroyed my pancreas and from all the beating in the body, and the toe was really messed up pretty bad. And but I wound up staying in the hospital for about 3 months. Then they took me out of the hospital before the doctors would discharge me and put me on trial, straight from the hospital to the courthouse. You know, so.
And did your political organizing end up affecting your legal case?
Repeat that for me.
Did your political organizing end up affecting your legal case in that courthouse?
I think so. Yes, I definitely believe so. Well, actually, because of the stand that I took, which was that the oppressor state had no right to try me, that I should be tried by a separate state that was not involved in the oppressing of my people. And because I took that stand as a political prisoner, I think it went against me. I know in both cases that I was charged in the federal and in the state jurisdictions, and both jurisdictions gave me as much time as they could give me. So I think it played a part. Yes.
And Could you explain this right to struggle for oppressed people?
Well, I think the international community has recognized, you can look at some of the Geneva Conventions and some of the treaties that were signed in the United Nations dealing with colonized and oppressed people. Most all of them give the right to oppressed people to struggle against their oppressor by any means, including arms. And throughout the world, for many years now, especially since the 60s and 70s, colonized people have picked up arms to try to get their freedom from the oppressor and have been recognized by other states as legitimate freedom fighters. And this state here, the United States, actually supports other people who fight against oppressive states, as long as they're not fighting against them or one of their close allies. Then it all changes. Then they, like I heard one of our other witnesses say, they don't recognize any political prisoners in this state. They criminalize struggle here, but a political struggle in the United States is always criminalized if it's a revolutionary struggle.
Got it. And when, let me see, how, could you actually describe for us the conditions of your confinement?
Well, all right. I was initially taken to a county jail and locked into what they call segregation. From there, I was sent to another county jail and put on the main line, the general populations. But all the time, I was always kind of pulled aside, like any kind of transportation. For instance, if I went from one prison to another, or one court to another, or from the prison to the hospital, because I was still under doctor's care because of the initial torture that they gave me. They would always have a whole caravan of police and helicopters following my car or surrounding my car, the car that I was being held in, which they never did to a social prisoner. You know, that was only set aside for political prisoners. When I was first found guilty in both jurisdictions, I was found guilty in this federal jurisdiction for the liberation of Assata Shakur and for the expropriation of an armored truck. And I was found guilty in the state court of attempted murder of police when we had a shootout or a shoot back. When they shot at us, we shot back. When I was first captured on the day that we were captured. I was always treated differently. For instance, when I was found guilty, instead of going to a regular prison, they took me to a lockdown prison, Marion, Illinois, directly from court. Marion, Illinois was supposed to be set aside for incorrigible prisoners who couldn't get along in any other prison. Then they'd send you to Marion. But I was never even allowed to go to another prison. I was sent directly to Marion. And all the time in Marion, the time that I spent in Marion, and I spent 16 years in Marion off and on. out of the 28 years I spent in the feds. In fact, I spent 19 years in lockdown prisons the whole time I was out of the 28 years I spent in the federal prison, and never for any offense. I never had a disciplinary charge or nothing like that that sent me to the prison. It was always, I think, based on my political beliefs and views, because anything somebody else did in the prison, they would always try to throw me into it. For instance, in Long Park, when I was in Long Park, one of the other prisoners, he was attacked by the police, and he killed one of them and wounded 2 or 3 of them. Now, I was nowhere near him. I was in another block completely, but they locked me up and said that I influenced him to do that. And so that's what I mean by being treated differently.
Got it. And are you aware of any other political prosecutions?
Yes. Yes, Abdullah Majid, Bashir Hamid, theirs was definitely political prosecutions. Both of them have died now, but they died in prison, you know.
And are you aware of any tactics that federal and state authorities use to eliminate political prisoners?
To do what, prisoner? Well,
eliminate political prisoners?
To eliminate, yes, medical neglect. Definitely, that's one of the ways they get rid of us, is that they don't give you the medical attention that you need and you deserve. Like Abdullah Majid, the one I just mentioned, he died of something that was very easily treated if they would have treated him, and he had been complaining about pain, but they wouldn't take him. They just give him an aspirin and tell him to go back to his cell. He eventually died from, I think it was a gallbladder or a kidney. I can't remember which, but we were told that it would have been easily treated if they would have initially treated. So yeah, medical neglect. That's one of the main ways they eliminate political prisoners.
And did COINTELPRO play a role in your life?
COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, absolutely. I believe that counterintelligence program I know that it was instituted to disrupt and to destroy revolutionary struggle or any real struggle against the system, but especially revolutionary struggle. The Black Panther Party, which I was a part of, was singled out as being the biggest threat in this country based on what J. Edgar Hoover said, the head of the FBI at the time. We were always singled out, attacked, and harassed, murdered, brutalized, you name it.
And thank you for sharing your testimony. I move this tribunal to receive any exhibits or documents that the witness wants to submit in addition to his testimony today. And I have no further questions. So thank you, witness, and free them all. Black Power, Black Lives Matter, and it's great. Great to be in community.
All right, thank you.
Sekou Odinga! Freedom fighter! Free them all! So now I'd like to bring to the platform longtime human rights organizer, mobilizer, sister, mama, queen, Efia Nwangaza, whose testimony will be directed by my sister, attorney Cynthia Roseberry.
May it please the court, Cynthia Roseberry for the people. Good afternoon. Would you introduce yourself to the jurors and tell them about your credentials?
My name is Efia Nwangaza. I am the daughter of a formerly incarcerated father and of Garveyite parents. I am a veteran of the NAACP Youth and College chapters and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Atlanta Project. A colleague and comrade of still imprisoned, aged and infirmed Imam Jamil Action. The Atlanta Project is the SNCC project which drafted the Black Power position paper, which became SNCC's official position, popularized by Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael. The Black Panther symbol, used first by the Lowndes County Freedom Democratic Party and now popularized by the Black Panther Party, was finalized on my kitchen table as a college student. I am a co-founder of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, NCOBRA, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement for Self-Determination, the African American Institute for Policy Studies and Planning, and the October 22nd Coalition, to name but a few. I am also the past national co-chair of the National Jericho Movement for Amnesty and Freedom of U.S. political prisoners. I hold a bachelor's degree in psychology and visual arts, a master's degree in African American history and emphasis on Black women's history, a Juris Doctorate in Anglo-Juris jurisprudence, with an emphasis on international law, and I'm a contributor to the UN Treaty Law of the Sea. As a law student and later as a lawyer over the past 40 years, I clerked for the late Cecil B. Moore of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Almanina Barber. With Cecil in dismantling the segregationist Stephen Gerard Will, and with Almanina Barber, one of the first police brutality cases in modern times, and more specifically against the fascist Philadelphia police chief, Frank Rizzo, who had led a brutal assault on students demonstrating for Black studies. In 2010, under the groundbreaking leadership of Ajamu Baraka, founding director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, I served as the U.S. Human Rights Network co-cluster leader for the Universal Periodic Review 2010. As such, I conducted extensive outreach and training to ensure civil society participation. I conceived, convened, and led a 6-year campaign, the campaign to put imprisoned U.S. political prisoners, COINTELPRO civil rights era activists, human rights activists on the global human rights agenda, 2010 through 2016. It was launched with the first review of the U.S. compliance with its UN or international obligations. The first review being the Universal Periodic Review of 2010. I, along with Attorney Standish Willis for the National Council of Black Lawyers and myself, for the Malcolm X Center for Self-Determination, jointly served as lead organizer and principal authors for the 2010 Political Prisoners, Prisoners of War, and Exiles UPR Shadow Report, submitted to the UN Human Rights Council at that time. Sister Professor Soffiyah Elijah, from whom you've already heard, provided the critical section on the impact of post-9/11 scapegoating on political prisoners and Muslims. The campaign was a remarkable success in that the USA was called to task and campaign demands embraced by each review committee. Particular thanks goes to Paulette Dote and Bonnie Kerness for their research, interviews, and contributions for the Convention Against Torture report involving solitary confinement and medical neglect. Thanks for financial support goes to my family, Ann Lamb, Jericho Movement, and the U.S. Human Rights Movement.
Thank you. The people tender Attorney Nwangaza as an expert in political prisoners, political repression, criminalization of dissent, and the Convention Against Torture. Attorney Nwangaza, I'm going to turn your attention now to your campaign, specifically to the timeframe 2010 to 2016, and in particular to 4 reports that you provided with respect to your expertise: the Universal Periodic Review, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention Against Torture, the Universal Periodical Review twice. Would you describe for us your involvement? And in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you to do each one, all 4 of them, and the responsibility of the United States with respect to the information that you provided.
Well, as Malcolm challenged us to take our enemy to the United Nations, not only did we hear that call, but we also recognized the call that was made by Brother Jalil Muntaqim in 1977, I believe is the correct year. Taking up both challenges, given the opportunity under founder director Ajamu Baraka, they're having the resources, we were able to take advantage of the resources of U.S. Human Rights Network and to advance this campaign. You've already heard what COINTELPRO represents. The UPR, Universal Periodic Review, is one of 4 treaties to which the United States is a signatory. It is distinct in that it is a country-to-country review, as opposed to the remaining 3, which are reviews by experts, to which, in all instances, the United States government is required to respond and to report its purported compliance with its obligations. And in the remaining 3, that its offer is evaluated by committee experts. In all instances, civil society has an opportunity to make input. In the case of the Universal Periodic Review, we were able to not only submit an effective shadow report, as they are called, but we were able to lobby and to convince Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran to join us in our demands. The United States was presented with over 230 what are called recommendations, since it's a country to country and no country has any greater sovereignty than another, no ability to order one country, at least in theory, to do anything. So they're labeled as recommendations, and you'll find that all of the language is very stilted and very circumspect. However, out of that 234, I believe it is, recommendations that were made, 2 of them spoke directly to the demands that we were making. And they're referred to as recommendations 92.153 and 92.154, in which instance, while Cuba and Iran's recommendations were made oral, Venezuela was in writing. And they specifically call for the release of all of US political prisoners and of the Cuban 5 who were incarcerated at that time. They also called for the release of Leonard Peltier and of Mumia Abu Jamal. And further, in those 2 clauses, call for an end to unjust incarceration of political prisoners in the United States, and again, expressly naming Leonard Peltier and Mumia Abu Jamal. The second treaty review was the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. The committee forms what is called a list of issues, wherein UPR has recommendations, other bodies have names that they use to describe the demands that they are making. The demand here, the list of issues, is cited in the official document at page 19. And in that clause, it specifically states, please provide information on steps taken to reduce the practice in some maximum security prisons of holding detainees in prolonged cellular isolation, including children and persons with mental disabilities, as well as to improve the conditions and duration of out-of-cell recreation. Please provide information on steps taken to ensure that persons deprived of their liberty have the ability to maintain regular contact with their family and especially their minor children. The United States was required to respond to that at its next hearing, and I believe that that particular convention was in 2013. The third review was what is commonly called the CERD Committee, which is the International Covenant for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the committee requests further information a la page 26, paragraph 26, page 12. The committee requests that the state party, meaning the United States, provide in its periodic report detailed information on the current status of political activists from the civil rights era who reportedly continue to be incarcerated. I will point out that they use the term political activists as opposed to political prisoners, because to use the term political prisoners is to assume, to reach a conclusion about the status of the person, and which none of them do. The United States and all other governments criminalize dissent and deny the existence of political prisoners in their and any other country, unless, of course, it's Cuba or China or Iran. The government responses to the UPR recommendation I hate to I'll just read part of it. The government placed every recommendation into one of three categories. Those that that enjoy their, meaning the U.S. support, those that enjoy support in part, and those that do not enjoy their, meaning the U.S.'s support. Most, of course, of the recommendations fell into the category of enjoy some support and in part. And of course, ours fell into the category of does not enjoy support. Again, the US government, like all governments, criminalizes dissent and denies the existence of political prisoners. We made very specific demands of each committee, one of which was a consistent and constant one, which came out of the work of Dr. Mutulu Shakur, who called for a national truth and reconciliation mechanism to investigate and compensate deaths and prosecutions of COINTELPRO civil rights era political activists. In addition to that request, we also appealed to them to recommend to the US government that it immediately address the egregious ongoing human rights violations by adopting and implementing the previously related UPR recommendations 92.153 and 92.154. And that the list of issues in paragraph 16, which is in essence the elimination of solitary confinement and medical neglect, which is viewed as a form of torture, to end the criminalization, isolation, and incarceration of COINTEL civil rights era political activists, including immediate release of all those terminally, severely, and chronically ill. Thank you. It was my pleasure to not only lead the campaign, but to be the sole author on the final three, actually it's 4 out of 5 reports.
Thank you very much. Have you provided excerpts from the 4 conventions that we've mentioned?
I have indeed.
We would tender those as People's 2 in evidence. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, my sister. My sisters. We have one last testimony to hear this evening as part of Count 3, political prisoners of war, before we break for the day and resume tomorrow. And it's going to be a recorded testimony with El-Hajj, I was about to say Malika Shukr, El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan, with Howard University student attorney Jerron Hawkins. And we're going to see that on the screen. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jerron Hawkins, and I'm here to examine Mr. El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. Good morning, Mr. Saalakhan. Can you please state your name for the record?
Yes, good morning. El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. I serve as Director of Operations for the Aafia Foundation, a Muslim-led human rights organization based in metropolitan Washington, D.C.
I understand you're presently engaged in a 5-city mobilization effort for Dr. Aafia Siddiqui. Could you inform us on the present status of her case and any background?
Yes. Dr. Aafia Siddiqui, she came to the United States for higher education at the age of 18 from Pakistan, from Karachi, Pakistan, her home city. She was a brilliant student. She did her freshman year at the University of Houston. She got a full scholarship to MIT, graduated from there with honors, and went from there to Brandeis University, receiving a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. During this period of time, she was also known for her extracurricular activity. She was very concerned about, sharing and spreading the correct understanding of Islam, countering a lot of the disinformation. And also, she had a big heart for humanitarian relief causes. She was the heart and soul of the Boston metropolitan effort to assist the Bosnians, Bosnian refugees during the Bosnian crisis of the 90s. And because of this activism, after 9/11, she became a person of suspicion simply because she had been so active, in addition to being this brilliant Muslim student. And that cloud of suspicion ended up following her home to Pakistan when she went back in 2002 after 12 fruitful years of study in the United States. The US targeted her as a person suspected to be a functionary for Al-Qaeda. In March of 2003, she ended up being renditioned. She was secretly kidnapped along with her children, disappeared for 5 years. And in 2008, 5 years after she was disappeared, 4 Arab Muslims escaped from Bagram in Afghanistan. And when they escaped, they told stories about what had happened to them, how they were secretly held and tortured. And they told the stories of this one woman that was being held at Bagram. They didn't know her name, but as they described as much as they could about her, people in the know began to put 2 and 2 together. This sounds like Aafia Siddiqui. And as pressure began to grow on the American authorities to admit they were holding a female prisoner, they ended up releasing her in a planned operation to have her killed, we believe, by Afghan police or soldiers. And she ended up being shot by an American soldier. And on the insistence of Afghan police and government officials, she was helivac to another part of Afghanistan to get emergency treatment. And then she was brought back to the United States in violation of Afghan sovereignty and international law to the United States. And then about 1.5 years later, in 2002, she was put on trial in New York City, just blocks away from Ground Zero. And at the end of the show trial, that's what it was, where all the evidence was in her favor, she, subhanAllah, she ended up being found guilty and receiving a sentence of 86 years. So now, despite the fact that she was the only one injured in an alleged offense, she ends up being charged successfully and prosecuted with attempted murder and given a sentence of 86 years.
How are you sure that Dr. Siddiqui was targeted because of her political beliefs and group membership?
Because there was nothing else. At that time, after 9/11, you may be too young to be aware of this, but after 9/11, there was a witch hunt around the United States for Muslims, especially who were active. I received 2 visits and 1 telephone call from the FBI during that period of time because of my activities. So, there was no other reason for her to be targeted the way that she was, except that she came under suspicion because of her activism.
Are you familiar with the term prisoner of conscience?
Oh, yes.
Briefly, for the record, could you state what it is to be a prisoner of conscience?
A person who operates from a perspective of conscience. Their conscience leads them to take actions, to take positions, to at times criticize governments out of the well of conscience, and then they end up becoming targeted because of this. This is a prisoner of conscience. In fact, I consider Aafia Siddiqui to be a prisoner of conscience because of the things that she did that especially were of help to elevating what Islam was versus what it wasn't, for her coming to the aid of Bosnian refugees and during that crisis. And also Imam Jamil Amin, he is a prisoner of conscience. And Imam Jamil, I mean, his situation goes all the way back to COINTELPRO. He is one of the, I would say, survivors. He is one of the survivors of COINTELPRO. He was targeted back in the day when he was known as H. Brown, as a young student coming in and out of the South into Washington, D.C. And he was in other parts of the North and the Mid-Atlantic. He was someone who continued to be targeted for suspicion after he embraced Islam and set up shop, established a community on the west end of Atlanta, and basically cleaned the west end of Atlanta up, cleaned it up, stabilized it.
Just for clarification, really quickly, do you believe that similarly to Dr. Siddiqui, that Mr. Alamin was also targeted for his group membership?
He was targeted because, well, for two reasons. One, one of the things that I've come to learn in my work as an activist over the years is that the memory of rogue elements within the government is a long memory, and that memory can be passed on generationally. Imam Jamil became a target in the 1960s as H. Brown. He remained a target all through the years after his embrace of Islam, setting up, establishing a community on the west end of Atlanta, and then, just doing the work that he did around the nation to addressing the gang crisis in cities and helping to rein that in. He remained a target. And one of the things that we found out during the discovery in the lead up to his trial was that he and his community had been under constant surveillance from a task force that involved both Atlanta police and federal agents, a special task force. And so, clearly, he remained a target of COINTELPRO, even though COINTELPRO was officially put to rest.
So with our entire examination that has taken far at this point, considering Dr. Siddiqui, Mr. Alamin, if they all were imprisoned for their group membership, that would certainly be a risk factor that could contribute to making the case for genocide in the context of this tribunal. So do you believe that there are still systematic government initiatives like COINTELPRO used to target group membership, thus creating these greater risks, thus, I guess, perpetuating these risk factors for genocide amongst brown and black people at the hands of law enforcement? Absolutely.
In fact, we have COINTELPRO today on steroids, and it's out in the open. It's not hidden anymore. It's in the open. And it has been militarized. It has been national securitized. I mean, yes, it's on steroids now.
In what ways would you actually say that it's manifesting itself through, like, what channels, news, social media, et cetera?
And in all of the channels. In fact, everything that was being done at the height of COINTELPRO, everything that was being done, the way that activists were being targeted for imprisonment, for elimination, for extrajudicial killing, the way that in the words of Niccolo Machiavelli and the advice he gave to the rulers of his age through the prince, you know, using law as a weapon of war. You know, everything that was being done during COINTELPRO, the manipulation of media and how, you know, how media was used as a justifying tool for what the forces of you know, the militarized police you know, wanted to do. You know, everything that we saw during COINTELPRO, the height of COINTELPRO, we're seeing now, and we have been seeing for some years now. I mean, we saw, in fact, you know, we saw elements of COINTELPRO, to be honest, before 9/11. We saw elements. The Muslim community in America was experiencing the growing reemergence of COINTELPRO before 9/11. After 9/11, that became the justification for just completely taking it off the shelf, revealing it publicly for what it is, and you know, it has become magnified in terms of, you know, the things that are being done. It's very shameful, and it's a reflection of the decline of this country as a nation.
Well, thank you, Mr. El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. At this time, I have no further questioning.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
We have another full day. Don't go yet. I'm calling up Eileen Weissman, who's with the Organizing and Coordinating Committee, who's going to share with us to whatever the final thing is that's going to close us out. We're going to, she would tell us what time in the morning we're going to be back. I do want to really thank the Howard University School of Law, Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, and the Movement Lawyering Committee for all the phenomenal work. There's an indictment that's being you know, passed around. We'll tell more about that tomorrow, but I want to call Eileen Weitzman off, or should I call my chief clerk? Come on up here, Jihad, brother Jihad Abdul Mamid. Let's give it to him. I mean, he's been my right-hand person throughout this whole measure. Say whatever you want to say, my brother, take it over. Former political prisoner who's come home and just, you know, hit the ground running.
Well, the good news, I don't have too much to say at all because we're hungry, we want to stretch. Saeed has been sitting here. I know you can't get up now because your legs are stuck. But I want to thank each and every one of you for your involvement, for your intentions, for your listening, for your hearing, for the jurists, to bring in the international community to us, to listen to us on our claim of genocide that's been happening to us for 400 years. And now, by the grace and mercy of Almighty Allah, our Creator, however you may perceive him to be, we have this opportunity to articulate to the world our experiences here, from the lynchings of the slave plantation, from the castrations to the bodies at the bottom of a lake, to the police killings now, to the marginalizations, to the glass ceilings, to the lack of access to medical care, as you will hear all of these things tomorrow. And I thank you, jurists, for your attention in this matter. We are so honored, we are so thrilled that we have this opportunity to present our situation to you and let that be proclaimed to the world. So Eileen Weissman, who's also on the coordinating committee, is going to explain what we're going to be doing tomorrow and what's going to happen the rest of the night. I want to really uplift my sister, Nkechi Taifa, for bringing this case. And I'll say this unabashedly, let the record reflect that a Black woman in America brought the case of genocide to the world to hear.
Collective effort. Collective effort. Collective effort. Come on, Ali.
So Jihad basically took my words away. Some of them anyway. He said it much better than I would have. But thank you so much for staying. And we're going to have Steve Bloom read a short poem, and then we invite all of you. We hope you'll stay. Downstairs, there's going to be a DJ and some Middle Eastern food and socializing. No planned program, but we just hope that you'll want to be able to talk to people and hang out and participate with us in helping to bring the tribunal forward to meet people and discuss things. And tomorrow we're starting, hopefully, at 10 a.m. So please try to come at least a little before 10. And we're also going to have lunch tomorrow. So the same from Jacob's Restaurant as was today. And we're ending at 5 tomorrow. We've got a really firm deadline. So in case you want to plan anything, you can be out of here shortly after 5. And we thank the judges, and thank you all again. Steve Bloom.
Back in 2016, when I was active in the campaign to free Oscar Lopez Rivera, somebody handed me a catalog of an art exhibit with work by Oscar and Carlos Alberto Torres. One of the pictures in that book, I'm holding it up here, is also on page 36 of your program, inspired this poem, which I want to share with you. It's called A Conspiracy of Flowers. You did not have to send me flowers, Oscar. You have given us so much time, after all, enough to assure me of your love. 26 years on that day, the artwork was hung from the gallery's walls, 35 by now, and counting still. You did not have to send me flowers, Oscar. I am sure it isn't easy to find them there where they keep you locked away, though perhaps not quite so difficult for one who truly understands the flowers when they speak to us. Che once spoke of love in words that have echoed ever since in so many hearts. Your great feelings echo too through these portraits of Mita at her sewing machine, of Filiberto, Soffiyah, Frida, Julia, of Che himself, joined by another, although nameless, gringo's nemesis, of corn vendors in their market square, of a deer drinking from its river, of a bowl filled with mangoes, or a vase with flowers. You did not have to send the flowers, Oscar. I would still have known how much you love me, enough to dedicate a lifetime to our great conspiracy of flowers. And so I offer you these lines, my small effort to reciprocate your love. Someday, I predict, a new law will transform colonialist conspiracy into a crime punishable henceforth by 35 years in prison. And all who are thus sentenced will be compelled to appeal to you or to me or perhaps to our children for clemency. Allow me to express the hope that we will treat them with compassion when the time arrives, for such compassion best demonstrates all the truths we hold self-evident in our vast conspiracy of flowers. Long live the conspiracy of flowers, our wonderful conspiracy of artists, of poets, of musicians, of sisters and mothers and daughters, of sons and brothers, of fathers, of lovers and comrades who have fallen and those who march on, even those yet to be born, because soon, perhaps only a day or 3 after you and I have joined the ancestors, they will be the ones who discover new ways to celebrate. Aware that all the prison walls in all the world are not enough to hold back our glorious conspiracy. You did not have to send the flowers, Oscar. There was no need to send me flowers. Thank you.